Hi, I'm Aaron Ironside. Hope you'll join me for the next half an hour as we take a look at some social issues that are affecting people all around us. And unfortunately, we live in a world where you may not hear a lot of balance and mostly some bias. And today's issue is a case in point where the cultural narrative says that the only thing that's important is that people from the LGBTQ community are given preferential treatment after all the years that they've been so poorly treated. But has the pendulum swung too far? What about athletics, where transgender people now want to compete against those who are born with different biological bodies? That's the topic in which we need to engage some active intelligence. On today's episode, I caught up with researchers Dr. Taryn Knox and Associate Professor Lynley Anderson from Otago University. They're two of three researchers who've worked together on a discussion paper for the Olympics on how to deal with the issue of transgender athletes at the elite level and how to deal with the biological advantage for transgender women that is so great that female athletes are saying, hey, hold on, we can't win against somebody born in a male body. Although it's complicated, of course, because everybody wants to participate in sport and we don't know how to deal with this complex issue. But suffice to say that even female athletes are saying, this is too far. I can't win against somebody born in a male body. Madison Kenyon is a university athlete from Colorado who's really coming out against this issue and saying this is a new kind of unfairness.
I just love the ability to go out there and compete, and I'm a really competitive person.
Running is in the blood of Madison Kenyon. The Colorado native from Johnstown runs women's track and cross country at Idaho State University. But there was a problem.
I competed against a biological male, and they beat me.
Madison lost to Jude Eastwood, the first transgender student athlete to compete in cross country in Division I at the University of Montana. Madison and her teammate Mary Marshall believe losing to Eastwood was unfair since Eastwood was born a male.
When you look at a lot of the facts and how a male body develops through puberty and all the advantages that they have biologically on females, that it really bugged me.
How would you see as something that's fair for if I was a transgender athlete? What would be fair for me in order to compete in a sport?
Well, I would say that as a biological males should compete against biological males, and biological females should compete against biological females.
But the American Civil Liberties Union disagrees. They challenged the Women's Sports Act and asked for the NCAA to move all of its events out of the state, claiming the law blatantly targets an already marginalized community in athletics and decreases their participation in sports. But that's not how Madison views it.
I feel like when girls talk about this, they get a lot of backlash, and it shouldn't be like that, because this is just promoting fair competition. We just want to have the opportunities that Title IX is supposed to protect to us.
Many of us will be very sympathetic to Madison's plight. It's an unfortunate reality that inclusion of transgender women means giving them an advantage that many female athletes know they can't possibly overcome. When it comes to the 100 meters, for example, the 10,000 fastest men on the planet, including some high school students, can run faster than the very fastest woman. It's just a reality that our bodies are different, our muscle componentry is different, and a male body is faster than a female body.
Caitlyn Jenner is coming under fire for remarks she made about transgender athletes. Jenner, who transitioned after an Olympic gold medal career, says she doesn't think trans girls should be allowed to compete in female sports. Those comments are drawing fire as several states now try to ban trans girls from competing. Here's ABC's Zareen Shah.
Tonight, California gubernatorial hopeful Caitlyn Jenner giving this controversial statement to TMZ on trans legislation.
So there's legislation in various states to ban biological boys who are trans from playing girls' sports in school. What's your opinion on that?
Question of fairness. That's why I oppose biological boys who are trans competing in girls' sports in school. It just isn't fair.
Although apparently our Olympic team does not understand that or agree, as Laurel Hubbard has just been announced as our first transgender athlete, despite having this clear biological and strength advantage. But I Must admit, I do feel for transgender athlete JC Cooper, who felt like she had done everything the authorities had asked her to do. She had done all the tests. She kept her testosterone levels at a certain level. But unfortunately, the authorities have said, yeah, but the biological advantage is still too extreme. But I understand that that is a very confusing and painful message for someone who's just trying to play by the rules.
Yeah, and it says that request has been denied. Male to female transgenders are not allowed to compete as females in our static strength sport as it is a direct competitive advantage.
What was your reaction?
Disappointment, and also not being surprised entirely because of the way that trans women and trans feminine people are treated in sports.
Do you think it's fair for you to compete in the women's category?
Absolutely.
Why?
Why not? I followed all the rules leading up to competing, and my own beliefs aside, that should be enough. This is what happens, right? When trans people meet all the rules, they'll just establish more rules to govern our bodies and our participation in society and in sport.
I am not without sympathy for JC Cooper and for transgender athletes. People who are into athletics, into sport, they want to participate. It's just not clear. How do you deal with this? It used to be so simple. We used to have just male and female, but now the transgender community have introduced a kind of complexity that frankly we're not ready for. And because, of course, the guiding narrative of the culture is inclusion's the most important thing, well, actually, it's not the only important thing. It might be important, but boy, at the moment it's coming at the expense of common sense that tells us, hey, we're going to have to stop and consider this more deeply, because it does turn out that there are advantages for the transgender woman competing against biological women that really are going to make this very much an unfair competition. And that's why, of course, the Olympic Committee trying to work out what kinds of rules are needed. Do we need to throw out our traditional understanding of all of this? Well, Dr. Taryn Knox and Professor Lynley Anderson from Otago University do tend to think that a big rethink is involved. They've written a research paper with their research partner to try and suggest some solutions, some ways forward. But frankly, friends, I am not sure that even their answers are going to fly, but I'll let them explain what they think might be the way forward. Well, let's talk about two of the big kind of issues that frame the conversation. On the one hand is the idea of inclusion, and it's fair enough that everybody in our culture wants to find their place and their place where they can participate. But on the other side now, fairness is almost as if these two are in competition with each other. Can you play out how those are the big ideas in this conversation?
Okay, so inclusion is really important, regardless of where you come from or what group you belong to. Inclusion is centrally important, and we all want to have places for people to, and a space for people to get involved in sport. We know that sport's important, and we know that sports is good, it's part of our healthy environment and so on. So we want to include people, but we've got to find a way that we can do that fairly. And so fairness is centrally important, especially as we get further up the sort of levels of sport, and particularly in the elite level and sub-elite to some extent. Mm-hmm.
And so it turns out, of course, that these two do seem to collide with each other, because on the one hand, it seems that most of us are quite happy to acknowledge people's desire to be known by a certain identity. It doesn't cost us a great deal to call someone her if that's what they wish to be called, even if we still have questions in our mind about how all of that really works. It's not too big a ask to be polite and inclusive when it's just at that sort of social level. But once we get into this competitive level, of course, suddenly we realize that actually some of the idea behind what it means to be a transgender person bumps into the science. In other words, that you might be born biologically male, but you really can't reverse a lot of that if you become a transgender woman. Tell me about the science and the fact that there's a certain kind of advantage that those who are born biologically male may have forever.
Yes, so we're not the scientists, and our scientist co-author is unfortunately unwell, and so I'm, although we're not scientists, we do know a little bit about the science. So some of the things that is the basis of that sort of advantage that males have over females, and that's evidenced by the records, the speed records, the weightlifting records, etc., arise because of the exposure to testosterone, but also the everything that about a male individual, and it means that the bones are bigger and the muscle growth is more, and the position of the heart is different in the size of the heart, position of the lungs and the size of the lungs, the amount of hemoglobin you can carry, all of that kind of sort of scientific basis is more likely in the male. You'll have all these things featuring in the male that will not be featuring for the female in quite the same way. And testosterone levels are significantly different. Now, prior to 2015 or around 2015, the IOC, and this is how come this has become a bit of an issue now, the IOC changed their regulations. So prior to 2015, there were a whole lot of requirements on people who transition from male to female to be able to compete, or female to male.
But much
less, yes. So nowadays, you do not have to have gender reassignment surgery. You've just got to have testosterone lower than 10 nanomoles per litre for at least a year.
And from there are some good things about that those changes, because not all trans people want to have surgery, or it's not available in their part of the world.
And it's not easy to access even in places that do have it,
including New Zealand. So that we're not so much worried about that. Our concern is the 10 nanomole cutoff. We think that's potentially too high to be fair.
Yeah. So it's significantly higher than what we would call cis women's testosterone levels.
Right, and prior to that, of course, when it was a requirement that the person had had gender reassignment surgery, their testosterone levels were much closer to a cis woman's.
That's right.
And of course, that's perhaps where this kind of unfairness is potentially out of control. I've seen it somewhere that when it comes to running the 100 metres, the top 10,000 male runners are faster than the world's fastest woman, and that includes some high school males, which just goes to show how big that gap is. Now, I'm interested, though, because, Taryn, you made a little side comment there about the fact that this issue really doesn't apply in reverse to trans men, to those who are born biologically a woman and then who want to live as a man. Now, they have presumably then a biological disadvantage. So in our kind of idea about inclusion, where does this fit? Is this an issue that really only applies to trans women?
It's an interesting question, because there is it doesn't seem to make so much of a splash in the male sporting arena to have a trans male in the male sporting arena. But if we're serious about fairness and we want to think about how to include trans males, we need to think about this as well, and how do we make a space for them, because it is they have a disadvantage.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Now, there is some, I was just thinking about the effects of, lowering testosterone. Now, that's going to affect some things, and it will reduce some of that disparity between men and women, but you can't change the size of the bones, and you can't change the size of the heart and lungs and the position of the heart and lungs, etc. You can't change some of this. Regardless of how much hormone therapy you have, it is set. And so there are some vestiges of advantage will remain for the trans women.
Yes, and you've called this a sort of tolerable unfairness, an unfairness we can learn to live with, so to speak. But where do we work out where that line is, particularly given also, as you've pointed out in your article, that different sports are not as affected by this unfairness? I mean, lawn bowls, as you use as an example, is not an area where testosterone levels are a great predictor of performance. So where do we work out where the line is?
I think that's the $64,000 question. Yeah,
it is really, really difficult, and that's why we came up with this idea that perhaps the way we think about it is flawed. So maybe we shouldn't be thinking about categories just for male and female. Maybe we should, sort of somehow dismantle the gender binary in sport, or the sex binary in sport, we should call it. Maybe we should dismantle it. We have categories for boxing, we have categories for, all weightlifting, all sorts of sport have more nuanced categories. Maybe we should be doing the same for sport generally, and just get rid of the male to and female categories in sport. And that's why we came up with that algorithm at the end, to sort of think about, well, maybe we're just doing it all wrong. Maybe we need to be more inventive.
What would you say to those who in response to that would say, surely that's kind of the tail wagging the dog? A very, very small group. I mean, the transgender community are a small group even of the LGBTQ community itself. So this is a very small group, and among them, elite athletes, an even smaller group of a smaller group, deciding that we should all abandon what has been our kind of traditional approach to competition to accommodate such a minority group.
Yes, and that's one of the criticisms we've received.
And I think, though, it doesn't just impact a small number of people. It could potentially, a person like me, I'm short and round. I'm not athletically built whatsoever, If we could somehow account for that, then I would be on a level playing field with someone who was more, athletically gifted than myself. So I'm not convinced it's only sort of applicable, or it's only helpful to a small number of people.
We'll talk about that nuance before we finish, because obviously the question there will be just how many different factors do you plug into the matrix before you decide? Because you've just added in a couple about whether you're short and whether you're round, and add to that whether you're a certain weight, a certain gender, a certain testosterone level, and where does that stop? I wonder though about where the potential for kind of some kind of abuse of that system also lives. I was wondering, for instance, my wife actually asked, do you think it would be possible that given that there's money to be made in sport, that someone might actually decide to live as a woman, knowing they could become a world champion and get a sponsorship deal? And what if, at the end of their career, they decided to transition back to being a man? What would we do with these sorts of potentially bizarre outliers?
Yeah, I wouldn't like to suggest that trans people are more into cheating than anyone else.
Well, that's the point. The person who cheats in that scenario isn't genuinely a trans person. They're a cheater who've noticed something they could exploit.
Well, that is possible, but that's when we look across to the Paralympians, and I think the Paralympians are a bit of a shining light here. Possibly we could look across to the Paralympians and just have, it was a bit of a mind-blowing situation for me. I was watching the Commonwealth Games in Brisbane, or on the Gold Coast, and I noticed that they had the Paralympians competing alongside, and they were in different races, but they were all competing alongside and doing the marathon and the half, whatever, together. And I thought, wow, this is cool. This is the way it should be. We're not pitching them against each other, but we're including them and bringing them along. And I think the Paralympians, I know that there have been people who cheat in the Paralympians, but we just need to have better sort of ways of addressing that and ways of making that fair. And the Paralympians have stepped up to that to some extent. Yeah. Do you want to add more?
Oh, no, not really. You can find ways of getting around or cheating any system if you want to badly enough. I think ours makes it A, more difficult, and B, the payoff is less. If we're looking at a range of different parameters, then you have to be cheating on multiple ones. So the likelihood of you being able to cheat and win is it's reduced.
In my limited reading, I've noticed that most of the rhetoric out of the transgender community has been around the inclusion ideas. They said, hey, look, we've followed the rules as you've laid them out. Don't keep changing the rules. That doesn't seem very fair. We've played by the rules as you've laid them out. But I don't see many examples of transgender athletes admitting, okay, I kind of get it, that I have an advantage here that means I may be, in fact, a world champion in something that I never otherwise would have been able to be so successful at. Is there an acknowledgement of this advantage?
Quietly, there have been people that have contacted our co-author and acknowledged that advantage. And that, look, let's be honest, the rules are as the rules are at the moment. And
if they meet the rules, go for it. They should be able to play.
Yes.
What I don't buy into is the idea that we shouldn't change the rules to create more fairness. So I think that's a flawed argument.
Well, let's talk about those new rules as you've suggested. And I appreciate that in a sense, this is so complex. If we just boil it down to the inclusion versus fairness argument, even I get stuck. I'm not sure which way to go. I can kind of be sympathetic to both sides of that argument. So the fact that you've suggested, what if we just stood back and rethought the whole thing? There's some validity to wanting to take a fresh perspective to a unique problem that we now face. But when you've highlighted the fact that it could be more than weight categories, it could be testosterone levels, it could be other kind of physical attributes, where do we stop? How do we work out how many different things to plug it in and how to weight those different things? Is your weight as big of an issue as your testosterone level, as big of an issue of your biological birth gender? All of these things seem very complicated.
Yeah. So I think what would have to happen is it would have to be sport related. So an individual sport, say swimming or athletics or whatever, they would have to have their own way of determining what parameters should be included and what don't need to be included. So, for example, someone like one of those elite Ian Thorpe or people like that, they have big feet. They've got big triangular bodies. They've got long, long arms with, paddle, like hands and feet, and away they go. So we need to think about what's important to a particular sport. Those kind of features wouldn't be any good for, possibly, some forms of gymnastics or other kinds of sporting environments. When you look at Simone Biles, she's she's quite short when you compare her with a basketball player, for example, and so her physique is perfect for gymnastics, and clearly she is, because she's fantastic compared to Ian Thorpe. There's body parameters that are more important for one sport than the other. So you'd have to calculate them per sport, and that would be necessarily to include the sporting organisation and physiologists and so on.
And we are in the process of doing that, but it's like you say, it's so difficult that it's been nearly 2 years since this paper.
And we're not finished.
We're not finished the next bit. So we totally acknowledge it's very, very complex.
I can't help but think, as someone who grew up kind of secretly hoping to be an All Black, very specific sort of very Kiwi male goal to have, whether in the future world it'll be anywhere near as kind of appealing to grow up dreaming that one day I'll be the under 65 kilo transgender, low testosterone, big armed, small feet. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's the categories will get so specific that will they lose their interest?
Okay, well, I don't think it would necessarily be that specific. And so one of the things we wanted to really avoid were 3 categories: male, female, and everybody else that doesn't fit into either of those. I think that's not fair, and I think that's putting trans people and so on at a real disadvantage. They won't be happy with that, and I can understand that completely. I wouldn't be happy with that either. So we weren't thinking of 3 categories, so it would be more than 3, but it wouldn't be hugely, nuanced in the way that you're saying.
Yeah, more than 3, less than 300.
More than 3, less than 10.
Yeah.
But you cope with the categories in boxing. You cope with the categories in weightlifting. You're fine about that. So
Well, they're only one dimension, though. It's just weight. That's all I have to worry about.
Yeah.
We do realise that it could change the nature of sport. People like to watch, the fastest, best athletes, We are aware of that, and we wouldn't want to have such fine-grained categories that we lose that, Yeah.
To finish, I'd like to take a sort of a step back, if we can, from the whole conversation and ask you, what have you learnt about the way in which we are having these kinds of conversations? I've very much appreciated the way that we've been able to talk today. We've been able to think through complex ideas without getting angry with each other. And yet I notice that, unfortunately, we live in a world where we tend to get very angry very quickly. We have very entrenched positions. What have you learnt about the social discourse?
Well, we seem to have annoyed both sides, so that's that shows that we're looking into things, I think, in some good ways and in some good areas. But I think we need to have conversations where we hear each other, where we don't shut each other down, where we we look at the science and get the science to help guide us and utilise that. What do you think?
Yes, I have. I think people are very strongly in one camp or the other, at least when we started this a few years ago. I think as time's gone on, my personal experience is people are getting a bit better at doing this open conversation thing. It's by no means uncontroversial, and I still get flack, but I really appreciate that some people are starting to listen, a bit more. If you've got a very strong view, it's very hard to stand back and look at the other person's side. So I really am thankful that people have started to be able to do that.
Professor Lynley Anderson and Dr. Taryn Knox from the University of Otago. I do appreciate their willingness to step into a very uncomfortable conversation, and they're trying their best to come up with some answers to a very complex problem. I think one of the things that makes this problem even more complex is this reality that, in fact, even within the LGBTQ community, this is an issue only affecting one side. After all, it's only transgender women who have the biological advantage. You notice there's no talk of transgender men because they have such a biological disadvantage that even the best transgender male is not going to be able to compete against biological males. And that means that this is very much a one-sided issue. It's very much an oddity in that sense. It's an outlier. Now, that makes it all the more complex to deal with. But frankly, I can imagine that if we don't tighten up these rules, what's going to happen is that transgender women who would never have been able to be world champions will find themselves able to compete at the highest level, and that the result of that will be that female athletes will probably decide there's no point being involved in sport and athletics anymore. I think you'll find a reduction in numbers of females participating in sport when they realise that actually you can't actually win in this scenario. It's just not possible. I'd love to know what you think the answer is, because I'm stumped, to be honest. I think all of these complex categories that are being suggested, too complicated, too difficult, and frankly, testosterone is not one of those kind of features I think that we can easily start classifying around, particularly when in this instance the testosterone levels of the person involved is something that they are choosing rather than trying to mitigate for biological inbuilt features. Things like weight in weightlifting and in boxing, well, they're connected to things like height, for example, so that shorter athletes with lighter bodies are able to compete against people whose bodies are similar. But they had nothing to do with really the fact that they were born in a smaller body. Okay, they might have some control over its weight, but I think that the fact that a lot of the issues we are talking about are not biological differences, they are chosen differences. And I think that's where the complexity lies, because if you can choose, then how is this fundamentally much different from other performance-enhancing drugs? Because in many ways, a transgender woman taking drugs to suppress the testosterone levels to meet the criteria is a kind of performance-enhancing drug with respect to elite sport. I know it's different, but it's also similar. And I think that's the problem, is that we're trying to have drug-free sport. Does that extend to people who are modifying their testosterone levels so that they can meet certain criteria? This is a complex issue with no easy answers. I certainly would like to hear your thoughts. You can visit the website activeintelligence.nz. Don't forget to subscribe. That way every episode will make it straight into your inbox, and I'd certainly love to hear your thoughts about this topic. We'll catch you next time on Active Intelligence.